Hello, Americans. I'm Kenton McNall. It's Constitution time. Today is February 18th, 2021. It's been a week since the end of the impeachment, a little bit less than a week, I guess. And I'm sure that many of you have all kinds of emotions about it, whether you're right or left. It's hard for me to avoid the feelings that a lot of people have been given a lot of thought to how to get around our laws and our Constitution, and coming up with some, in my mind, not great reasons that we shouldn't find justice in such egregious situations as what happened on January 6th. But I started this program, Constitution Time, with the idea that perhaps if we focus on our Constitution, that we could come together and find solutions to things, because our Constitution is worth defending. For over 220 years, our Constitution has been a good thing for the United States of America, and it's been tested hard. Civil wars, other actions, and things like January 6th have tested our Constitution. And it has, by and large, stood the test of time. But I certainly feel that it needs to be shored up. And so we want to have a conversation about that today. What possible changes could be made in the Constitution or in support of the Constitution to our laws that could help us with the situations that we now face? So the vote in the impeachment was 57 votes for impeachment and 43 votes against. And these days, 57 to 43 is almost an overwhelming majority in the Senate, where so many things are decided by one or two votes. But as with many important things in the Senate, you need 2/3 majority, which I can't remember the last time a 2/3 majority was reached. Even 60 votes is hard for the Senate to get these days. And to really change the Constitution would not only require 2/3 vote in the Senate, but it would also require 2/3 of the states to ratify. And if it's an issue that the left favors, getting 2/3 of the states by number of states is virtually impossible. The right would have a better chance to get 2/3 of the states by physical count. So sometimes it seems that we're trapped in this 50% zone. It's going to be hard to get out of it. Nevertheless, we need to talk about possible solutions because we really need some, because we came perilously close to something that would have been devastating for our way of life, for our country, for our democracy, and for our children. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit this evening. And I'm going to switch over to our conversation mode with our guest right now. Give me 1 minute. Once again, I welcome my former colleague and friend of the show, Mr. Stephen Steck. Good evening, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. So it was a pretty interesting show that our government put on last week. And I imagine that there are some folks that are very pleased with all the results, but I think the majority of us are not pleased with the results, neither from a procedural standpoint nor from a result standpoint. But I think what I'd like to do this evening is just talk about, what we saw and what it showed that we need to do to shore up our Constitution. And the most obvious thing to talk about I think, is the fact that basically the Senate made the statement that you shouldn't or can't impeach a president who is no longer in office. And not only
Hmm.
did they say that you can't impeach that president, but basically they were saying that if the Senate is in the hands of the opposite party, or the same party rather, as the president, it's not just January that's in question. You could have 2 or 3 months of a penalty blackout for the sitting president where you're not going to be able to get a trial finished, and therefore you're not going to have an impeachment. So whether you say that's just a few weeks of time or months of time, and I think it's the latter because of the level of partisanship we have now, they're basically saying that during the most likely time that a president would commit a crime to try to keep himself in power, to sell pardons, to start an illegal action for or against another nation, during that most critical period of time, you wouldn't be able to impeach the president. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's if you look at pretty much any other country, that's often the most tumultuous time is during that window, especially post any kind of election where power is supposed to transition to a different party. Um, it's definitely one of the more dangerous times for any democracy out there. Um, so having it where your safeguards are kind of gone poses a threat.
Well, and some of what I'm the most distressed about and what I saw was the blueprint that's been created for the next despot wannabe. But we'll talk about that in just a second. So, the other thing I saw that immediately followed on that decision was the idea that the Senate voted and decided as a body that it was constitutional for them to impeach the president even though he was not still in office in 55 or 56 to 45 or 44 vote. But the bottom line is when the Senate votes and it's a majority rule, makes the decision, that's what the Senate decided. Yet the minority leader stood up after acquitting the president and stated straight out it was not constitutional for us to impeach the president while he's not in office. We did not have the jurisdiction. So if they're saying we can ignore what the Senate just decided, what else can be ignored that the Senate has decided? Could some rules, for example, be ignored? What is that precedent that's been set there?
Yeah, I mean it's probably not a great precedent, and for the next at least 2 years, that precedent very well may land on Majority Leader Schumer, because if other senators decide to push the limits of what we've decided on these rules, but we're just not going to obey them, it will pose a lot of potential issues. Um, yeah.
Well, that's basically what happened. They just blatantly said, "Yeah, no, we voted and decided it was constitutional, but we don't think it is, so he's not guilty." And that also became something that they hid behind, did it not?
Yeah, I would say it definitely was, or at least it came across as kind of a reason that was easy for them to state. Some potential other reasons may not have sat as well with their constituents, and so this was the one that they felt would sit the best. So that was kind of what they decided to cite as their reason, rather than saying, oh, well, we feel like the president's conduct was perfectly fine, which is probably not going to sit as well with constituents.
Now, this issue, as most we talk about today, it's, you know, the right on one side of this issue and the left on another. But there's no question that 2 years from now, 4 years from now, roles can be completely reversed, and the other side could be doing the exact same thing. And I think the issue for Americans is this the way we want our government to work? Because it's not very effective. Um, I think you brought up an issue as we were talking before the show that I thought was very interesting as well. And maybe you could talk about that again with regards to what is impeachment becoming here? Is it becoming something that's going to happen every other day? Or is it going to be seen as completely ineffective and not worth pursuing?
I think there's kind of two potential outcomes, and both could very easily happen at the same time. In fact, from the Senate side, I I don't think we will see a conviction on any kind of impeachment unless without extremely extenuating circumstances, I'll say. So I think from the Senate side, conviction is probably just off the table at this point, due to partisanship. It's there will never be however many 17, 15, however many senators of the president's party um, that decide to impeach without the president having done something arguably much worse. But from the House side, this suddenly opens the door to, oh, well, we can just gum the whole system up if we have control. If we feel like the president is doing things we disagree with, even though the Senate may not convict, we could just continue to send impeachments, articles of impeachment, repeatedly to the Senate over and over and over again, which they have to act upon. I mean, it may only come up one day, but if you just continuously do it, that's day after day after day, because the Senate does have to hold the trial within a specific time window of the articles being sent.
Well, there are already discussions underway by Republicans in the House to impeach Joe Biden.
Mhm.
Um, for what I have no idea, but it certainly isn't on the level of sedition and incitement to riot. But I think that's the door that's been opened, just as the 60, the filibuster beating, magic trick that Harry Reid came up with has been used repeatedly. I think impeachment will now be used repeatedly as well. And I'm not
Yeah,
saying that there weren't good reasons to bring impeachment, but the way it was done just always felt rushed and never had a chance because of the partisanship.
yeah, it's definitely a tough call, because you can sit and say, oh, well, it never had a chance, but then also, if it never has a chance, then is your only uh, deterrent against a president committing worse things, is it gone? So it's a tough call. I wouldn't want to have to be in the House's shoes in that situation, but it definitely did open the door to, if in 2 years' time the Republicans manage to take the House, or later down the line, 6, 10 years from now, if the president is of a different party, that party can the House can gum up everything and just continuously send. And we very well may see 4, 5, 6 impeachment presidents. It may just no longer be a number that is that interesting. Um,
And when the process becomes meaningless, it becomes much easier for a chief executive who wants to do wrong to do lots of wrong. And,
Mhm.
I think we've seen the first steps down that path. Witnesses. Um, the whole circus around witnesses, which was both, I think, in this impeachment, a function of time and a function of witness wars that could have drugged things out forever. But it just made me feel like, the impeachment is supposed to be some kind of pseudo trial that can never end in a criminal conviction that sends somebody to jail.
Mhm.
But it's gotten to the point where it's pseudo trial by slideshow, and again just taking it down that meaningless path where the founders intended it to be something very, very meaningful, uh,
Mhm.
and we're getting away from that very quickly.
Yeah, I definitely was somewhat disappointed that no witnesses were called in either of the impeachment hearings, um, or the impeachment trials, because I do feel like it, there should have been more investigation, and more testimony. Um, the the reasons that I heard from both sides just didn't kind of ring all that true to me, so it just kind of felt like the senators and the House were defeated. Like just felt, oh well, the outcome is determined already, so why bother? Which is definitely not how you want to handle an impeachment trial. I mean, if the outcome is always just predetermined, then why bother having it in the first place? And that's a pretty big protection in our Constitution gone.
Well, and one of the reasons that it was so predetermined is that because there were no witnesses, what changes a jury's mind from what they might have heard or read or knew about the crime before they even became a juror? Well, it's witnesses. It's the
Mm-hmm.
testimony of people who can say, yeah, I was told directly to do this, or whatever that testimony might be. So it's a disappointing process. So in terms of constitutional fixes for some of these things, would it be impossible even to get an amendment that says yes, the Senate absolutely can and must impeach someone even if they're not in office? There is no period of a president can do whatever he wants with no penalty.
Um, I feel like that's a very worthwhile amendment, uh, and could be written in very simple language that would hopefully not, um, be disagreeable to too many people. But I just don't foresee it happening, because the argument I would imagine would come from both sides is, well, where does it end? Like, can we impeach a president that was president 20 years ago because we disagree with him now, or because of some conduct we discovered 20 years later? And what's the ramifications of that? Can you impeach somebody who's ran for office, who has been in office twice? And it would just get argued to death. And I also don't see two-thirds of the states, or two-thirds of the Senate agreeing with it.
Yeah, and so now's when you have to start coming up with the ifs, the ifs that you'd have to write into that amendment to prevent the 20, which has already been brought up by multiple people. Oh, well, we're going to go back and get this president or that president.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like if something's in the Constitution that's such an uh, obviously wrong position has been taken, and is stopping, in this case, impeachment, that we're obliged to do something about it. And so I think that's something that I'll definitely be looking into. What can we do about that? What are the possibilities? But at the end of the day, I agree with you. Imagining our divided country coming together enough to get 2/3 of the states to do anything is a long shot. It just uh, seems like a very high bar right now.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the best we'll get for the time being, at least, is the fact that the Senate is very precedent based, and now they have held a vote saying that you can hold an impeachment trial for a former official. Um, Even if people try to cite it as, oh, this is why I'm voting to not convict, um, it's distinctly possible that even if it was in the Constitution saying that you can impeach a former official, that those people who were citing that would just come up with a different reason. So um, the precedent at least has been set, which is a good thing in my opinion.
Except, well, I'd argue that it wasn't because it was immediately broken and cited as being broken by uh, the minority leader. So we'll have to see how that one plays out. I agree with you that the Senate has in the past been precedent based, uh, and hopefully at least will continue to do that, even though many of their precedents are not that great. But
Mm-hmm.
speaking of precedents, there's a lot of other things that have happened over the last 4 years that I think need constitutional help as well. One is the concept that I think is a critically important concept of oversight. Um, Basically, the president over the last 4 years has created a blueprint for any despot that wants to come along, Devin Nunes, and basically ignore every communication, subpoena, request for information that the Congress sends over with absolutely no ramifications. Now, I know some things went to court. I never heard of a single one coming back with an order to provide. Um, but basically, they just said, you don't have oversight over us. We're not going to respond to your requests. Does that not, again, need to be shored up for us to have meaningful checks and balances, separation of powers, and oversight?
Yeah, I mean, that's arguably one of the most terrifying things that came out of the past 4 years in terms of precedent is the fact that the executive branch can just ignore subpoenas and possibly vice versa, and that the courts will more or less refuse to get in between the two branches and make decisions. They did for a couple of them, but then it got kicked back to court and back and forth, and even now, like the latest thing we saw, the courts are just kind of kicking it down the road and saying, "Oh, well, yes, we'll hear the trial eventually. We don't have a date set." Um, so we definitely need to find a way to shore up the fact that things are reasonably well outlined for um, for congressional oversight, um, and what happens if you choose to ignore them. There should probably be some very outlined punishments for choosing to ignore them, written in laws or a constitutional amendment or something.
Well, the basic problem there is that the Congress has no way to enforce um, a subpoena. And the way that the government might normally enforce a subpoena would be through the Department of Justice, which, of course, works directly for the executive branch, which brings up another precedent that's been set that I think is perhaps one of the most dangerous, which is the idea that the Department of Justice is the president's private law firm, and acted as such during the last 4 years, uh,
Mhm.
harassing and filing suit against enemies of the president at his direct request, apparently, um, not pursuing things that should have been pursued, directly stepping in, the Attorney General of the United States of America directly stepping in to the sentencing of convicted criminals. Um, Bad news all the way around. And, but, I started that by saying Congress has no way to enforce their subpoenas.
I
Could I
mean, so
go ahead?
technically, the technically the sergeant at arms can and does have a force that should be able to enforce congressional subpoenas. The problem is as far as I know, it has never been fully used against someone in the executive branch. It should technically be legal, and it's supposed to be how Congress can enforce their subpoenas. Um, but it's also potentially another precedent uh, that they may not want to set, um, throwing people in the executive branch in uh, holding cells until they testify, um, may not be something that either party wants to see.
Yet we have to have oversight. We can't. I mean, because we got dueling precedents now. We can't have the entire executive branch just saying, talk to the hand, um, when oversight is attempted. And I'm not, that happened. I'm not trying to exaggerate. I don't think it happened the entire 4 years, but once it started happening, it didn't stop happening, and
Yep.
a lot of things that needed to be known remain unknown.
Yep.
Stephen, was there anything else about the impeachment that kind of troubled you or that you observed?
Um, Not that I can think of offhand. It was definitely um, a little disappointing to watch, uh, because it seemed that um, so many of the people went into the impeachment without open minds. There were many times that uh, people would comment on how few senators were actually there listening. That you'd think like this, an impeachment trial would be top priority, but there were anywhere from 5 to 10 senators out at pretty much all times, other than when votes were happening. Um,
Well,
which,
I agree with you 100%. And here's an observation. If I'm a senator and I state up front, my mind's already made up, I don't care what evidence is presented, and then I take an oath to be impartial in considering all evidence and making my determination, have I not violated that oath the moment I took it? And should I not be removed as a juror? That's what would happen in any other court in America.
yeah, I mean, in any jury, like you be instantly removed and potentially held in contempt if you tried to state something like that. Um, and yet in the Senate, it's totally fine. I mean, in the Senate, it was totally fine for senators to confer with um, the the defendant's lawyers, and totally fine for senators to confer with the prosecution. I
And
wasn't
totally
see that
fine
on
for
either
the
side.
Chief Justice to refuse to sit in and do his job.
Yeah.
Constitutionally, it's his job. And it
Hmm.
was totally fine for Pat Leahy, a Democrat, to become the Chief Justice. So, yes, it's this pseudo trial, and no rules can be applied to it other than the rules that the Senate decides to apply themselves.
Yeah, I would definitely love to see an amendment that clearly outlines how an impeachment trial should take place, saying that at all times, all senators must be, quorum is 100%. You cannot continue if you are missing a single senator. Or something along the lines of, if you are absent, then you don't get a vote anymore. And you're no longer, your vote doesn't count towards anything. Um,
Or if
so
you're
that,
up in the gallery with your feet up reading your newspaper.
yeah, I would like to see, I would love to see an amendment that just clearly states how a trial should take place. I don't see that happening, but that would be a good outcome.
Our founders thought they could count on us for more than that. They thought that we could be adults and handle what they put down, which they did purposefully, by the way. The level of detail was purposeful.
Hmm.
They thought they could count on us for that, and unfortunately, they can't. They couldn't. Stephen, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great chatting.
And to all of you, thank you for watching and listening. We hope we provoked some thought. Maybe you got the juices going a little bit so we can all get together and do something about some of these things. We'll see you next time. Take care. Beware of COVID. Hope you got your shot. Good night.